Tranquility du Jour, May 21st, 2018. Hello there, this is Kimberly Wilson and welcome to the 421st edition of Tranquility du Jour. We're chatting with Corinne Zupko on her latest book, From Anxiety to Love, a radical new approach for letting go of fear and finding lasting peace. And let's be honest, who doesn't want a little bit of that? So in this week's edition, we discuss anxiety, stepping out of our stories to shift perception, and then listening to our inner therapists. I think you're in for a special treat today. And also, I wanted to remind everyone about Tranquil Treasures. And what that is a wonderful online treasure trove for anyone who has signed up for Tranquility du Jour. And you can do that at kimberlywilson.com/lovenotes. And it's a newsletter I send out 1 to 2 times a month with things like recipes and playlists and inspiration and updates on things happening and early bird specials, all sorts of things along those lines. So if you haven't signed up for that, please do so because I've recently added some additional components such as an art journaling video and yoga videos and mindfulness and creativity tools, all sorts of fun things. So please check that out. And basically, it's your own private library of Tranquility du Jour tips and tools and tricks. And again, it's accessible just to newsletter subscribers. And a big thank you to those of you who've been listening to this podcast since 2005. I can't believe we're already at the 421st edition. And I wanted to mention, too, anyone who would like to join us for Year of Tranquility. So this is a program I pulled together for 2018. And the great thing is you can drop in at any time. And this month we are focusing on minimalism, which is such an important topic of this idea of really getting clear of how our time and our money and our energy, how we're utilizing all of this and all this stuff that surrounds us and what we're eating, how we're dressing, things along those lines, to really think about how can we make it as simple as possible so that we can focus on what really matters. So if you're interested, you can sign up for the month of May, or you can join us for the whole year. And there is information and links to all of that in the show notes. Also, if you wanted to join us for Yoga and the Animals, which is a 1-hour yoga practice at an animal sanctuary in Ellicott City, Maryland, right outside of DC, about an hour outside of DC. On June 9th, we have 5 spots left for that. So it's pretty full. And if you want a spot, please go ahead and sign up. A link to that is in the show notes. And of course, also at pigsandpugsproject.org. Also, if you want to come to Paris, July 23rd through the 27th, there's 1 spot left for this writing workshop. And basically, if you are a journal writer, a letter writer, a blogger, a person aspiring to write a book, this is a wonderful retreat excursion for you. All the details for that are in the show notes, and you can also find more at kimberlywilson.com/retreats. There's also West Virginia coming up, Costa Rica next February, and Tuscany, July 2019. And one last thing before we hear from Corinne, I just again want to say a big thank you to everyone who tunes in to Tranquility du Jour. And again, I know many of you have been longtime listeners. And I want to ask a request. If you have a moment to pin a review over on iTunes, I'd be so grateful, or whatever mode it is that you are listening to this podcast. I'd really, really appreciate it. My hope is it helps other people find the show and ideally a little bit more tranquility as we hear from authors, activists, and artists around the globe. Corinne Zupko is the author of From Anxiety to Love. As a licensed counselor and keynote speaker, she's helped thousands of individuals through her one-on-one counseling, weekly meditation classes for corporations, and the largest virtual conference of ACIM in the world through the organization Miracle Share International, which she co-founded. She lives in New Jersey. Visit her online at FromAnxietyToLove.com. Welcome, Corinne.
Thank you so much for having me, Kimberly. I'm so excited to be here.
Congratulations on your new book, From Anxiety to Love, a radical new approach for letting go of fear and finding lasting peace.
Thank you. It's been such a journey, and I'm really excited to be able to hold it in my hands now and see and hear from other people who are reading it and what they're getting out of it. And it's just a really, really wonderful feeling.
Absolutely. And it's a gorgeous book. I love the cover. I love the font. It's like very well done. New World Library.
They really did such a good job. I was so happy with it because I feel like the cover really portrays just the peace and the tranquility that is, what I'm helping folks to reconnect within themselves throughout the book. So I feel like they really did a good job expressing that on the cover.
So tell me, what inspired you to write this book? As we were speaking before we started recording, the book of writing is a process, quite the process. And so I'm curious about your journey from anxiety to love and what led you to this work.
Yeah, well, that's a great question because really the book was born out of my own journey with really debilitating anxiety. And for anybody listening who's ever had a panic attack or just gotten so hijacked by fear and overwhelm and, worry that's just out of control, it's so hard to try to describe what it's like to somebody who's never had a panic attack or have been in that anxious, highly anxious state. And so I spent most of my life in a high level of anxiety. I've had a number of psychiatric anxiety disorder diagnoses starting back way when I was really young. And when I was in college, which is a time when mental health issues surface for a lot of people, that's when I broke down with panic attacks and started having a really hard time. And at that point, I discovered through my mom a spiritual text called A Course in Miracles. And I found that this pathway was really helping me reconnect with the peace in me. And I studied the course and I did the lessons and really got involved with it. And yet I found myself in about, I think it was 2009, having another really debilitating anxiety episode. And it was at that point that I realized that I had been using my spiritual practice almost as a Band-Aid. It was kind of like something that I'd run to feel better and then put it down and go back to doing what I was doing versus having a really deep, transformative change within myself that actually shifted the way that I perceived the world and viewed the world. And it was at that point in about 2010 when I was getting better, like my anxiety issues were really falling away, just like, shedding an old skin. I started writing about what was helping me, and the results are in the pages of From Anxiety to Love. So the book really captures the principles and practices of A Course in Miracles that help me in getting to live an anxiety-free life, which if you knew me back then and could see me now, it's like night and day. It's a big change. So I took my time writing the book because I didn't want any deadline anxiety. And so I actually wrote the book over 6 years and then got the publishing deal after that. But it was really born out of my own healing that the book came into existence.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I'm so proud of you. And it was funny as I was reading through your bio, I'm like, we have a lot in common. MBSR teachers, therapists, and, it's like who probably listening to this podcast cannot relate to having some anxiety at some point in their life, if not kind of those of us who live in the cities or what have you. I mean, not that if you live in the country, you don't have anxiety, but I feel like just the fast pace of city living, really like it heightens it. It contributes to it. And so, what would you say for our listeners is like the biggest lesson that you have learned through your journey with anxiety?
That's a great question. And this is going to sound maybe a little bit woo-woo or getting out there, but bear with me. This has really, really worked for me. In the biggest thing that I've gotten out of my anxiety is that in allowing it to become my teacher, I learned that my previous thought system was very much based on fear. Everywhere I looked, I saw threats. I saw possible danger. I saw, things to be afraid of. And in this journey of really shedding layers of fear, to uncover the love that is within me and within all of us, anxiety ended up showing me that I am actually not this limited sense of self, that I identify, as a woman, and my name is Corinne. And yet I learned through my anxiety that what I am and what we all are is actually much greater than that. We are, I believe, made of divine love, and that's love with a capital L, not like, just romantic love. And it's really that love that unites us all. And as we can learn to re-embrace and remember that true identity, the anxiety has to fall away. So in a nutshell, the biggest thing that I've learned from my anxiety is that my small self of Corinne is actually not the whole story. It's not who I am. I'm something much greater, and that is what we all are. We all share.
Whenever you say the small self too, it makes me think of, and the story I'm telling myself is.
Yes. Oh my gosh. That's it. I mean, the small self, we're making up this small self based on our stories, based on what's happened to us, based on what we want. It's all this storytelling. And when we can step out of the story and be fully in the moment and be fully in that awareness of love, that's a really powerful place to be, to step out of those stories that can actually really hold us back and bog us down.
And how do you recommend that people step out of the story? I mean, this is like truly the $1 million question, right? Because we live in our stories so deeply. And so what has been kind of the way in which you personally have found, or the way in which you've worked with clients to help them step out of the story and kind of see a bigger picture?
The number one way that has worked for me, and that I teach in my programs, and this is based on this practice called, this text called A Course in Miracles. Miracles, if we take that word and define it, we can define it in one of two ways, and we can use either definition because they're both based on what the Course teaches. A miracle is a shift in perception. So it's a new way of perceiving. It's a way of shifting our mindset from a fear-based thought system to a thought system that's based on love. And that love, again, being love with a capital L, is a sense of oneness, a sense of connectedness with each other. And it's in the present moment, outside of our stories. The other definition of a miracle is an expression of love. So every time we express compassion and warmth and care to others and to ourselves, we are extending miracles and extending that love. So the main way that I have worked, and I'm not saying I'm always out of my story, believe me, this is a work in progress. I've come far enough where I don't have anxiety anymore, but we all, vacillate and get tripped up with our stories from time to time. The number one way that has helped me is to pause and to ask for a miracle instead, to ask for a shift in perception. If I'm stuck in seeing things through my filter, through my lens, and in my story, and if I can, number one, recognize that, I can then say, hey, I want to see this differently. I want peace. I want a miracle. I am willing. And that willingness opens us up for a different perception to come in. So it's been this sort of decision for wanting miracles instead of, my current perception that has really helped me to step out of the story, if that makes sense.
You know what I love about this from a mindfulness angle is it makes me think of stop.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So listeners, if you're like, what in the world is STOP? I love this acronym. And the S stands for stop. T, take a breath. So as you said, pause, right? O, observe what's happening. So like physically, emotionally, mentally. And then P, proceed with awareness.
That's everything. That's everything. And when our problem is that we lose our awareness and act or react from that sort of knee-jerk, impulse place, and not from a conscious place of having made a choice. So I agree with you. I really love this acronym, and I think it's a great tool for us to remember to stop and pause and observe and proceed with awareness or with love.
Right. Or with love. Yes. Whatever is a little different from our autopilot, right? Which is, those well-trod kind of neuropathways that we are really good at, So it's this idea, right? I love the Viktor Frankl quote of, and I'm paraphrasing, but between stimulus and response, there's a space. And within that space lies our growth and our freedom, which I think really speaks to what you're saying about pausing and asking for a shift in perception.
Yeah, it really does. And that pause and that asking is, if we think about that pause and that asking of being a demonstration of our willingness to shift our perception, willingness is everything. We have to want to step out of our story in order to step out of our story. We have to want to change in order to change. That willingness to experience movement in our lives, to experience a shift, is really, I think, the fundamental, the basic piece that we have to put into place. Because if we want to stay in our story, if we want to stay in the status quo, we're going to, and we're going to resist change and resist doing anything, to make a fundamental shift. So that willingness is really important.
And, one of the things you mention a lot in the book is this idea of the inner therapist. And so I love this because I recently even saw a flyer that a therapist was putting on about how to be your own therapist. And I was like, what a great idea. And, so as I was reading your book and I'm like, oh my gosh, listening to your inner therapist and, look at your inner therapist. It's like, show up for therapy with your inner therapist daily. Like, I was like, oh my God, this is so great. Because, for a lot of people, they have therapy weekly, maybe even every other week. And so it's quite spread out. And so this idea of really being able to tap into our inner therapist daily sounds phenomenal. So can you tell us a little bit about A, what in the world is an inner therapist? And B, how do we tap into it and connect daily?
Yes, absolutely. So your inner therapist, and I want to preface what I'm about to say with reminding people that this does not mean that we need to go quit therapy. We can be in therapy with a therapist and do this work with our inner therapist. I don't see them as having to be one or the other. They can very much be used together. Our inner therapist is there's many different words for it. Our wise mind, our intuition, our inner guidance system, in A Course in Miracles, it refers to inner therapist as your inner teacher or Holy Spirit. However you think about it, whatever word it is that you're comfortable with, what matters is that you're remembering that this is a part of your own mind that knows what's best for you. It's part of your own mind that is actually outside of our fearful thought system. So I define in my book, and A Course in Miracles refers to the fearful part of our mind as our egos. And most of us are walking around in ego. Hate to break the news, but typically when we are, interacting with others and coming from a fearful perspective, we tend to be identified with the ego, which is the small sense of self. It's me identifying with my sense as Corinne. My inner therapist, however, is very much a part of my own mind, but it's outside of that tiny, fearful thought system. When I say tiny, it can feel really big and overwhelming, but the inner therapist is really, again, this voice of love in our minds that gives us guidance and helps us, find that place of peace and happiness within, because that's its job. Its job is to help us reconnect with that peace and that joy within ourselves. So that is what the inner therapist is. We all have access to this. And you already know, if anybody listening, if you've had those intuitive hits, that time, when something happens and you just know what you need to do, you know how to do this already. That's your inner therapist. And it's just a matter of practicing and consciously choosing to turn our minds to that part of our mind instead of the fearful part of the mind. And that's really the how. We can say, it can be as simple as inner therapist help. It can be as simple as just saying the word help. I want to shift. I talk about in the book a 3-step process for healing. And it involves, and we've talked about this somewhat already, number 1, finding your willingness to see differently, to see out of your story, to see something different. So find your willingness, step number 1. Step number 2 is to turn toward your inner therapist within, whether, again, you call it your intuition or your inner guidance. You turn toward this part of your mind and you say, inner therapist, I want a miracle instead. Show me, help me. And then the third step is to trust, to just trust that we've called upon this wise part of our minds. We might not be ready for the answer. We might not hear the guidance right away, but we, A Course in Miracles and in my book, we talk about how the moment you ask, the answer is given. However, we might be too blocked with fear at times to hear it. So if you've ever, tried to ask for guidance and then you don't hear anything and you keep asking and it's like, well, should I do this or should I do that? And we keep self-talking and filling up our mind with chatter. We actually have to learn how to pause. There's that pause again, and get quiet to listen, to try to drop into our bodies and feel into where that guidance might be coming up in our body. Whether some of us, I experience it sort of in my core, like just that gut feeling when you just know something, and other people might feel it in a different place. But that pause, again, is really important. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And, I'm curious just to provide our listeners with some examples. There's 3 words that you've used a bit that very good. And, I think we all know what you're saying, but I was like, it might be helpful to have examples. The first one is of ego. I think we all know what ego is, but if you could kind of give an example of whenever you talk about the ego and the small self, how does it show up? And then also with fear, because fear is in your subtitle and you've mentioned it a bit, right? This radical new approach for letting go of fear. And I think for some people, it might be like, what do you mean by fear? Like being scared of, I was thinking like ghosts, which is so random, but just like a random fear, right? But I think this is like a deeper thing that you're addressing with regard to fear, and because you even mentioned fearful perspective. So if you could kind of elaborate on that. And then miracle again, because I get it. You already described it. But again, if you could kind of give an example of these 3 kind of buzzwords or keywords that I think are so critical to your book and to this work, I think it might really help us to better grasp it.
You bet. So I have so many examples that I could go into, and a lot of these examples are from the book. The number one, if you want to see the ego in action, just turn on the news, and anything that you see, that's filled with conflict and pain and trouble, this is of the ego. So the ego thought system is typically fearful and painful, and in our lives, this shows up in conflict. It shows up in fears of sickness or scarcity or lack. An example in the realm of body stuff, because being afraid of sickness was like my number one trigger. I would get so freaked out if I thought something was wrong with my body. I'd rush to the doctor and, get testing and make sure that I was okay. And it was very much a hypochondria type of pattern. So this example, and this is a pretty powerful example. So I was having concern over a symptom. I went to the doctor because I was very afraid, and I was getting blood drawn in the doctor's office. And the nurse said to me, "So why are you here?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm here, for this reason." And she's like, "Well, that's not good." And I was like, "Well, it's a symptom I've had my whole life. It was just something that I suddenly decided I needed to get checked out, even though it was something that I had my entire life." And when I told her what that symptom was, which is just bruising, basically, I bruise easily, not a big deal. She's like, "Well, that's not good." And then she goes, "Don't you pass out on me." And so guess what I did? I was in so much fear that I started having the pass out response. I had to rush and put my feet up and get me juice and gummy worms. Her ego met my ego. Her words heightened my fear. So it was like we both sort of agreed to join in this fearful circumstance where I was coming in with fear, and she was kind of validating my fear in a not good way that made the fear grow. So that's an example of ego in action. And me being fully identified, of being this small sense of self, this body that I'm, subject to anything that my body might, what might happen to my body, that I could get sick, those type of things, which of course are things that we don't question in the world, but I'm actually prompting us to question that in my book. Fear, the next keyword that you highlighted in this example, fear is what escalated in this situation that made me almost pass out. I was like on the verge of panicking when she's like, well, that's not good. That's not good. And the physical aspect of fear, fear can come in our thoughts of like, oh my God, what is this? Or what is going to happen? Fear is also very physical, where we might have that adrenaline rush. I remember feeling like tingling in my stomach and at my feet and feeling really shaky and sweaty and clammy. So fear has very much a very physical reaction as well. So in this example, the doctor, when I went into the doctor's office after, I had my gummy worms and my juice and I was okay, the doctor was like, well, let's investigate this further. I want you to go to an outpatient hospital clinic and get more lab work done. And I said, great, in my head. I was like, okay, I hate getting blood drawn, as you can tell. And number two, I hated hospitals even more. They were a big trigger for me as well, to have even more fear and more, feeling really scared of going into a place where a lot of people maybe are there for medical reasons, and that was triggering for me. So there I was in this situation, going to this outpatient lab at a hospital. But this time I said, okay, my ego, my fear ran the show last time. I don't want to do that again. I want a miracle this time. I want to have evidence show up in my experience that I am love, that I am made of love, that I am safe, that I can trust the universe. I want that. I want that. I want that. So that was my declaration going into the second round of getting some blood drawn. Now, I was still scared. I still remember feeling very nervous as I was going in, but I kept saying in my mind, I want a miracle instead. I want peace. I want peace. I want peace. And that really is what a miracle can be experienced as, is a renewed sense of inner peace. I go into the outpatient clinic, and unbeknownst to me, the mom of one of my college roommates is sitting there behind the desk. She's like, oh, Corinne, hi. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know you worked here. So we started chatting, and I thought she worked at the front desk. Turns out she's a nurse. So without my asking, she accompanied me to the back, and she did the blood draw herself. And we chatted the whole time about my girlfriend and her kids and had a nice conversation, no pass out response. And when I was leaving the lab, she said, Corinne, it was a Monday. She said, Corinne, it's really, amazing that you were here. She said, I never work on Mondays, and I got called in 30 minutes before you showed up. So I was absolutely blown away that I was determined this time to not choose for fear, to instead have love and reinforcements for love show up in my experience. That was the miracle to me, that I had affirmation in this circumstance, that by my declaration of wanting to see differently, wanting a different perspective, wanting to have a different experience other than that fearful experience that I had before, that this time she being there in the clinic was the miracle, which enabled me to trust that there's something to this process, that when I can shift my mind by choosing a miracle, by working that 3-step process that I mentioned before, that things can show up in my experience that can reinforce my decision for choosing for love instead of fear. So the miracle is the peace, it's the joy, it is the expression of love, and really that shift in perception from changing my mind from fear to love. So does that make sense?
It does. It's so beautiful. And I love the 3-step process. It just makes it easier to kind of follow. And, I'm curious too, because you talk a bit about inner peace, right? And the importance of that, or finding that. And so do you have a quick little tip or tool on how you would encourage listeners to kind of go about having more inner peace in their life and less anxiety?
Yes. And it really, having more inner peace is what the book is all about. And it's what even the 3-step process that I mentioned, that's how we work to restore our inner peace, by accepting miracles, by accepting shifts in perception. So the experience of finding peace is not that we're finding something that we don't have. It's that by saying, I'm willing to see it differently, I'm turning to my inner therapist, and I'm going to trust that it's done. What we are doing is allowing a layer of fear in our mind to be removed, to be dropped, to bring us closer to the awareness of love's presence that's already in us. So we're not gaining inner peace because we don't have it. We actually have it already in us. We've just piled layers and layers of fear on top of it. So we're no longer aware of the peace that's the birthright for all of us. So the process of healing is about removing those layers and returning to that peace and joy and love that's in all of us. And we do that. The main steps are through those 3 steps that I gave, and I break those steps down in the book, and we look at it, I think, in 20 different directions and 20 different steps, because it is there's so many opportunities for ego to get in there again and say, oh, well, I just did those 3 steps and nothing happened. Now what? So the now what is what I give alternative ways of approaching, different ideas and different steps with in the book.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thanks, Corinne. It's so helpful to kind of hear just the continual breaking down or peeling back of the onion, as we like to say in therapy.
Yes.
Now I'm curious, just kind of before we get to our last question, do you have any advice for our listeners who may be suffering from anxiety, or even whenever you're in the midst of a panic attack?
Definitely. So if you are suffering with anxiety, number one, I want you to know that you are not alone. There are 40 million Americans, that's just a statistic in the States, that suffer from anxiety disorders. And I think that number is low. I've heard somebody say that we're no longer Prozac nation, we are Xanax nation. And part of the problem is that many of us don't talk about it. So we think we're all alone, but we're not. So I want you to know, number one, you're not alone. Number two, you are not going crazy. That's, I think, the most common thought that people have if they're having a panic attack or a high degree of anxiety is that they're losing their mind. You are not losing your mind. You're just having a panic attack. You're just having a high amount of anxiety. And panic attacks happen in time, which means they have a beginning and they have an ending. So it will come to an end, even if it feels like it's not going to. It absolutely will. The other tip that I'll give for somebody in the middle of a panic attack is that you can, and we can all do this right now, if you place one hand on your belly and your other hand on your chest, and if you just breathe, however you're breathing, just breathe naturally as you just normally would without trying to change your breath, you might notice that your chest, if your chest is doing most of the moving, that means you're breathing from high up in your chest, and it's a more shallow breath. It's actually a more anxious breath. If you just consciously soften your abdominal muscles, and doing that right now, just soften your abdominal muscles, however it is that you're sitting, automatically you find that your breath is a little bit calmer, a little bit deeper. It's a more diaphragmatic breath. And it's like when a baby or a puppy breathes, they breathe with their whole belly. So we've forgotten that as adults. So we tend to tighten our stomachs and then we automatically breathe from high up in our chest. Instead, soften your stomach, allow that breath to flow through your stomach, and that's going to bring your arousal level down if you're having a panic attack. And even right now, if you're not, and you just want to feel a little bit calmer, that can be a really helpful thing to do.
Beautiful. Thank you. So helpful. And, I know we can find you from anxietytolove.com, and listeners, there will be a link to all of this in the social or in the show notes. But I'm curious, Corinne, is there anything else that you have going on that you want us to know about besides your book?
Yes, thank you. I have a meditation album. It is the From Anxiety to Love meditations, which are the meditations in the book. However, I have guided them and set them against beautiful music, and it's all professionally mastered. And I've gotten such amazing feedback from folks who are having anxiety that these meditations are really helpful. The music is incredibly calming. So if you're interested, you can actually download 3 tracks from the album for free at FromAnxietyToLove.com/meditations. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that I do have a 6-week From Anxiety to Love class coming up. So if you're interested, just go to my website, click on the events tab, and you'll see what is coming up in addition to the different speaking engagements that I have on the calendar as well.
Beautiful. And then my last question for you is, how do you find tranquility? So the name of this podcast, Tranquility du Jour, and it's this idea of infusing tranquility into our busy, hectic, everyday lives. So what about you?
One of my favorite ways to find tranquility is when I wake up in the morning, before I get out of bed, I look at the wall opposite of my bed where I have made you can almost think of it like a vision board, but I made it into like a Mod Podged painting almost of my angels and guides and spiritual figures that I relate to and resonate with. There's a picture of Buddha, there's some angels, some saints. And every morning when I wake up, I open my eyes, I look at my dream team, I call them, and I put them in charge. I say, I give you today, use me as you will. And that brings me into a place of tranquility and peace and excitement and joy to begin my day.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Corinne.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so much fun.
So you can find Corinne on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and then I also put a book trailer to her beautiful book in the show notes. And the show notes, of course, can be found at KimberlyWilson.com/blog. Also mentioned the podcast was Love Notes and the events that I have coming up. And there's a link to sign up for the Love Notes in the podcast show notes, and then also all the events that I mentioned. And would love to have you join us for that. There's also a link to our Compassion is the New Black Tea, which proceeds benefit Pigs and Pugs Project, which is our organization that gives micro grants to pigs and pugs around the U.S. in need, and then also hosts special events such as Yoga and the Animals happening in June. There's also links on ways to find me online from Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, along with the link to Tranquility, my locally sewn eco-friendly fashion line, and also my 5 books. So another request, if you have a moment to pen a review of any of these on Amazon or Goodreads, would be so, so grateful. And the great thing is they are all available via Kindle now. So you can find information about that, of course, over on Amazon. And if you're new to Tranquility du Jour, please peruse the FAQs. It gives lots of insights into the work that we've been doing, my goodness, since '04, so for the past 14 years, as a blog and then beyond. So it's always a treat to meet new listeners, and I love hearing from you, and I can be reached at hello@KimberlyWilson.com. There's also links to a variety of Tranquility-filled e-courses, the Tranquility du Jour podcast app, and a spot to read about my passion for animals, which continues to grow and grow. So thank you so much for being here. And as always, I wish you a delightfully phenomenal, tranquil week ahead. Namaste.